going to be in 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4. We introduced Solomon as he won the kingdom last week. David wanted him to be placed as the next king. I think you can go all the way back to the time of his birth, and he was beloved of God. So Solomon is destined to be king, and he's destined to be a great king. There's going to be a lot of things during the reign of Solomon that were not true prior to his kingdom and not true after his kingdom. So he is kind of the pinnacle, and unfortunately it happens awfully quickly. You only have Saul and David, and then all of a sudden, you're at the top of the dynasty, and it's a little bit downhill from there. We're going to look at some things individually, but when I say the name Solomon, what are some of the things that come to your mind? Wisdom, right? He's known for his wisdom, and that's where we're headed. We're going to talk a little bit about his contribution to the wisdom literature movement of that era, and obviously his wisdom literature that he brought to the scriptures. What else? Well, his mama? No. Do what? His wives. He had a lot of wives. 700 wives, 300 concubines is the final count. His first one we will meet tonight. He gets her from Egypt, but she's certainly not the last. She's just the beginning of great things to come. What else? Should probably immediately think about the temple. Solomon is the builder of the temple. David stockpiled things to use to build the temple. He was the architect and put a lot of time and effort into getting things ready. But God would not allow David to build the temple because he was a man of war. Too much blood on your hands to build a place of worship. Solomon was certainly not a king of war. He had a very peaceful 40 years or so as the king over Israel. Things went really well. He was a politician rather than a general. And like I said, his way of doing things worked out really, really well for Israel for that time frame, not so much in the time frame that immediately followed. So we'll start with some of these passages that look at Solomon and his good traits. As we get farther in, we'll find some things that Solomon did that we don't find appealing. But in chapters 3 and 4, there's a lot of very good things to commend Solomon to us. We'll just start with the first 3 verses. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building the palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. Remember, David went to a lot of effort to bring the Ark of the Covenant into what we now call the city of David, that pinnacle at the top of Jerusalem. And having done so, there was a place of worship, and the Ark of the Covenant were all there near where Solomon was living. But rather than take advantage of that, Solomon was going out to the high places. In their culture, and really in a lot of the cultures around the world, a high place, an elevated place, was usually chosen for a place of worship. So if you're going to have a festival that's going to include a whole lot of sacrifices, you're going to do it at a high place, up on a large ridge or up on a mountainside, because they felt like that was closer to where God was. If you wanted to get closer to God, you went up. And, being raised in the tradition in which I was raised, we always talked about heaven is up and hell is down, right? That's the directionality of the thing, even still in our vernacular. In fact, when people don't want to say the word hell, they'll say, well, so we still have that kind of imagery in our mind that heaven is up and hell is down. But he starts out, he was not completely faithful to temple worship even after he built the temple. And that was partially because of his many wives. He wanted to make sure that they were happy. He wanted to make sure that the alliances he made with other kings were intact. And so he did some things politically that ended up dragging him and other members of his kingdom away from true worship of God. As we get farther down, we'll look at some stats of the things that he was able to accomplish, even in spite of all these things. God loved him. God wanted him to do well. And so if you look down at verse 4, you'll see this very famous connectedness between God and Solomon. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. Right? So remember, this is not a mark of a good thing that Solomon is going up to the high places, but he goes up to the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. So this was not an afternoon retreat. This took several days to go through the motions of sacrificing 1,000 burnt offerings. You can also imagine that there was a pretty good crowd with him, because part of the sacrifices would have then come back to Solomon and to his guests. Part of it would have gone to those who were making the sacrifices. Part of them would have come back to Solomon. So they're having a huge festival along with these sacrifices, but they're doing it to the right God, right? Wrong place, right God. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, "Ask for whatever you want for me to give you." And Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You've continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I'm only a little child, and I do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people that you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Now, when we study this account as little children, we just get that phrase, Solomon asked for wisdom. But we don't get the big picture. Right? Solomon's not just some guy who wants to be wise. Solomon is overwhelmed by the size of his responsibility. He's looking at his father David. David was a good man, an upright man, and you're rewarding my father David by letting me have the throne. And I realize this, but just look at how big this job is. Is there some way that you could give me enough wisdom to be able to do the right thing in governing the people? And what we'll see in Solomon's history is that, again, he studies wisdom. It's a hobby, I guess, of his. It's a pursuit of his. And he does a lot of study and writing about just the subject of wisdom. But it has a purpose. It's not just an academic pursuit. He wants to know, what can I do to make this the greatest kingdom that I can make it? And part of the answer to that is that God is going to give him all of these things. Now, God comes back and says, not only will I give you the wisdom, but I'll give you the things that you didn't ask for. I'll give you wealth. Solomon was one of the richest men that ever lived. I don't know what his holdings would be worth in our day and age, but we're talking in the Bill Gates, and we're talking in that upper echelon of wealthy people in the world, and that he would give him honor. Now, one of the things that he does not ask for, according to this account, is that he doesn't ask for the death of his enemies. So if God is giving him all the stuff he didn't ask for, then add to that he's going to be successful and his enemies are not going to be successful. So God's going to give him wisdom, he's going to give him wealth, He's going to give him honor, and he's going to make sure that the kingdom is intact and that Solomon himself is intact. So all of those things he receives, and then he wakes up. He realizes that it was a dream. So in my mind, I've always thought of it as this interview. God comes to Solomon and they have this conversation, but it was actually a dream that Solomon had of what was going to happen in his kingdom. Okay, run over to verse 16, chapter 3, verse 16. And here's the most famous of the cases that he heard. And again, as a little child, we hear this story, and it's a little tough for little kids to deal with this story. But this is the story of the two women. And if you look in your text, it tells us what kind of women. But when you're a little child, they don't tell you that these were two prostitutes. These were two prostitutes who were sharing a house. Both of them get pregnant. Both of them have children in the same week. One of them rolls over in the middle of the night and smothers her child. And I'll just add this in for what it's worth. I don't like co-sleeping. In my family, we didn't co-sleep that I know of. Both of Beth's girls slept with her for long periods of time when they were little bitty, and it terrified me. Maybe because I was told as a little child about this story and the idea that a mother might roll over on her child. So this one stuck with me. This story has always kind of stuck with me. So when she wakes up and finds that her child has been suffocated, she switches the babies. She takes her baby and gives it to the other woman. And when they awake in the morning, then the woman whose child is actually still alive is with the wrong woman, and she has the dead baby in bed with her. She says, when I looked at the baby and I looked at his face, I knew it was not my baby. So the two are arguing about who still has a son and who does not. And eventually this is taken before King Solomon. Imagine a case like that getting all the way to the Supreme Court in a matter of days. Right? They're to the absolute authority in the kingdom. He has the right to do anything he wants with the women and with the living child. And what's Solomon's decision? Let's cut the baby in half, and we'll give half to you and half to you, and everybody wins. Well, how intelligent was that? How crafty? Because the woman whose child had died didn't care about this baby, and she said, oh, what a great idea. Let's do that. But the woman whose child it really was said, oh, no, let her have the baby. Don't harm the baby. And Solomon knew immediately that the true mother was the one who cared more about the baby than about winning the case. So that kind of ruling went out, and people began to hear about Solomon's wisdom. So it's not just a dream that he had. God truly does give him wisdom, and the wisdom that he receives is so amazing, so interesting that people begin to pay attention to what Solomon is doing, and his reputation begins to grow. So let's go over to chapter 4, and we're going to look at some things that were going on physically as far as his kingdom was concerned. And then we're going to look at his reputation and some of the things that he accomplished as far as his literary side. Okay, chapter 4, verse 20. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. What does that remind you of? That's Abraham's promise. Right? So by the time you get to Solomon's kingdom, Scripture tells us that the promise that God made to Abraham is now in place. The people of Israel are as numerous as the sand of the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. So if you're going to be the king, that's what you want. You want all of the people of your kingdom to eat and to drink and to be happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines as far as the borders of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all of his life. Now skip down to 25. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. And so everybody is well taken care of. Everybody's garden is blooming. So again, as long as Solomon is king, everybody's life is good. He had 4,000 stalls for his chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Now, if you're a horse person, just add it up. How much feed is involved in taking care of all those horses? They thought, I don't know how long ago it's been, back in the last century anyway, that they had found Solomon's stables. And as far as the archaeology world is concerned, some are convinced, some are not so convinced that this has anything to do with Solomon and his reign, but they have found some rather large buildings that could have been used for housing this kind of bunch of horses. Now, let me ask you this. If you don't have a war machine, if you don't need chariots to go into battle, why do we have all the horses? And why do we need to know about all the horses? Because Solomon was rich. That's what they're telling us. It's kind of like saying, have you ever been to Jay Leno's house? If you go to Jay Leno's house and you look at all of the vintage cars that are lined up in Jay Leno's garage, it's just amazing. Well, why do we need to know that? Well, A, he likes cars, and B, he's got enough money to have what he wants. So all of these horses say Solomon was rich. And part of the equation is Solomon liked the equines. He was into horses and had plenty of them and plenty of chariots for them to pull. All right. Verse 29. Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, since I've never been, in a farm or anything like that, I don't know how to take care of animals. This seems like pretty big place, all those farms.
Mm-hmm.
And 12,000 horses.
Big horses. Absolutely.
And feed them, clean up after them, all that.
I'm sure he had a full staff that's all they did.
For everything, yes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about how big a place was it.
Linda, you got an idea?
Big.
Big. We're going to go with big. It was big.
You heard about that dairy last week that burned that had 18,000 cattle in it.
18,000 cattle in the dairy.
They died.
Yeah.
18,000 cattle.
So it's huge.
I'm kind of wondering what does that mean? I have no idea. One horse is too big for me.
Yeah. One of the reasons that we never had a horse when I was younger was they're too expensive. So, when you have this many horses, it was terribly expensive. There were people who were responsible for bringing feed to these horses, right? Some of the people that were vassals to the king, I'll take care of you, but when you harvest, you bring so much of your grain to feed the horses. So there was a lot to it, I'm sure. But again, everything was at peace. They didn't have to worry about the Amalekites or the Amorites coming in and, where were we? We were in Judges, I guess, before the kingdom was established. And every year when the crops would come in, these traveling bands from the Ammonites and what was the other group? Anyway, the groups from right across the Jordan River would all come across the Jordan and just pillage, just take everything they wanted, to the point that the people who lived there finally moved. And, the book of Ruth, they moved across to where the money was and where the crops were. They moved across the Jordan River into the other country. So it was tough times, but while Solomon was king, it was all taken care of. So the horses were happy, the people were happy, Solomon was happy. Look at verse 29. Here's the description of Solomon's abilities academically. When I think about people in his time frame, I don't think about academics. but Solomon was evidently very academically astute. God gave Solomon wisdom and great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand of the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. His fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. By the way, in the book of Psalms, we only have 2 of them, but he had 1,005 psalms. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard about his wisdom. So this morning we talked about the Queen of Sheba, who makes that long trip just so she can study at Solomon's feet. He was the professor of all professors in that time frame. And when it says that his fame spread all the way into Egypt, if you were famous in Egypt, then you were famous in Africa as well. So that's probably where she had gotten the news, because they would go to Egypt to get their wisdom. It was during this time frame that we're building pyramids. We've got advanced civilization that's moving forward rapidly in Egypt, and people are wanting to know, what do these folks know that we don't know? And they would get up there and they'd say, well, you think this is amazing? You ought to go up there and meet Solomon. The guy's amazing. And so all the folks would move on up the Mediterranean coastline and meet Solomon. So he was the center of the wisdom movement of the 9th century BC. He is more than just the king of Israel. He is one of the greatest scholars of that whole time frame. So folks want to know what Solomon knows. And as a result of that, we have some Old Testament literature that's pretty cool. Right? We get what he said in Proverbs. And by the way, Proverbs is not just Solomon. This is Solomon's writings plus Solomon's collections. He knew people that knew stuff, and so he would bring it in. So we have some of the Old Testament that was written by people who were in other countries, but by the hand of God and by the intervention of Solomon, they end up in Scripture. So we read some of those things and we think, wow, it's a tremendous collection of wisdom. Well, it's because Solomon was just that key to all of the wisdom that was going on in the Middle East during that time frame. So, Lord willing, next week we'll start delving a little bit into the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And I'll just tell you, when I was teaching at Northwestern, we offered this class occasionally, not every semester, but it was entitled Hebrew Poetry and Wisdom Literature. Now, if you're an undergraduate student and you see the title Hebrew Poetry and Wisdom Literature in the catalog, are you going to go, oh yeah, that's what I want to take? They were always very small classes and very enjoyable. They were the kind of students that you could really spend some time with. Anything else? Any questions? Okay. See you guys later.